Judge Helena Ward had sentenced thousands of people in her 20-year career, but the old man standing before her that morning stirred something tighter, meaner, somewhere just beneath her ribs. He looked like trouble that had outlived its expiration date. State versus Leonard Miles, the clerk read. Leonard stepped a little closer to the microphone. 69 years old, dark skin mapped with lines, gray hair clipped close, hands rough and scarred like someone who'd worked with him all his life. His suit was borrowed and a size too big, the collar of his shirt slightly frayed. He held a thin folder to his chest the way some people hold a Bible. Helena didn't bother to hide the sigh in her throat. Another one. Mr. Miles, she said, glancing over the sentencing report instead of him, you have been found guilty of felony theft and fraud. Multiple counts, spread over several months. You targeted elderly tenants in your building with fake maintenance fees and illegal late charges. Her tone was flat, almost clinical, but beneath it was that familiar hardness, the certainty that she'd seen this movie too many times to be surprised by the ending. In the second row, a young woman in a navy blouse gripped the wooden bench, knuckles white. Leonard's granddaughter, according to the file. Social worker. No criminal history. Strong family ties, the report had noted. Helena skimmed past it. The prosecutor recited the state's recommendation. 6 years in state prison. Restitution where possible. He abused a position of trust, the young woman said, voice steady. The victims were his neighbors, his own community. Leonard's attorney, an overworked public defender with shadows under his eyes, began to rise, but Helena was already closing the file. Sit down, counsel, she said. I've read your memo. I see the health issues, the lack of prior felonies, the letters from neighbors. None of it changes the fact that Mr. Miles exploited vulnerable people who trusted him. She finally looked at him, really looked, but what she saw was not him as much as every older black defendant she'd ever sentenced, filtered through years of tired assumptions. Men your age, she said, ought to be examples. Instead, you became a warning. Her gaze dipped to the guidelines chart in front of her. The state recommends 6 years. This court does not find that sufficient to protect others from your willingness to take advantage of them. The words came easily the way they always did. Mr. Miles, I sentence you to 8 years in state prison. There was a soft gasp from the gallery, quickly swallowed. The granddaughter's hand flew to her mouth. The public defender looked like he'd swallow glass. Leonard did not flinch. He just stood there, very still, the folder still in his hands, eyes on the judge. Not defiant, not pleading. Something quieter, like a man watching a pattern finally complete itself. The gavel struck. The sound ricocheted against marble and oak. Next case, Helena said, already reaching for the next file. She did not know that in 6 minutes, the wrong folder would land on the wrong desk downstairs. That 3 floors above, an analyst staring at a screen of numbers would finally see what had been hiding in plain sight, and that by the end of the day, Helena Ward's career would be carved into before and after. Right now, all she knew was that an old black man with tired eyes had left her courtroom in handcuffs, and that she felt, as always, completely justified. The judge who trusted her instincts more than she trusted numbers. Judge Ward liked to tell new clerks that she had grown up in chaos. Not the cute, sentimental kind, big family, small house. Actual chaos. Her father in and out of jail for bar fights. Her older brothers arrested before they were old enough to shave. A mother who worked nights and prayed mornings and aged 10 years every time the phone rang after midnight. Helena clawed her way out with scholarships and stubbornness. Law school had given language to a feeling she had carried since childhood, that rules were the only things standing between some people and complete ruin. The law is the floor, she would say, folding her hands on the bench. Mercy is the ceiling. But mercy means nothing if the floor keeps collapsing. It sounded good. It made for neat pull quotes in profiles and speeches. And it gave her a way to ignore the discomfort that sometimes stirred when she looked at the faces standing before her and noticed, distantly, how often they were the same color. In public, she was tough but fair. Defense attorneys kept informal score. Older white men who came before her on fraud or theft charges were professionals who lost their way, family men under pressure, pillars who stumbled. Elderly black man, ka zikr honache, thought for 23s. Bilkul ob hum usko center p rakti hain red heart, main puranaya version leak raha hun jaim, elderly black man, ka zikr clear ho, or stories ayata narration-based ho. Cam dialogues, lekin structure wahi rahi jo tum sample main dia the hook, Judge Cobb background, pattern investigation, twist, fallout epilogue. Judge handed down tough sentence to older black man before discovering the truth. The elderly black man standing at the defense table looked like he belonged anywhere but here. His name was Leonard Miles, 68 years old, with a stooped back and careful hands. His skin was the deep brown of old photographs, his close-cropped hair gone mostly silver. The cheap fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3B did nothing kind to him. They accentuated the hollows in his cheeks, the faint tremor in his fingers as he clutched a worn leather folder to his chest. To Judge Nora Hale, he looked like a stereotype that had outlived its excuses. The state versus Leonard Miles, the clerk intoned. Leonard stepped closer to the microphone. In the second row, a young woman, his granddaughter, sat rigid, her work ID still clipped to her blouse. She had the unnerving expression of someone trying not to beg. The prosecutor summarized the case. Months of unauthorized fees charged to tenants in Leonard's aging apartment building. Elderly neighbors coerced into paying cash. Receipts missing, ledgers altered. The narrative painted Leonard, an elderly black man acting as an informal building manager, as a quiet predator hiding behind wrinkles and polite smiles. Judge Hale skimmed the pre-sentence report and saw what she expected to see. Low income, no college, decades of odd jobs. No prior felonies, but an old misdemeanor from his 20s. Letters from neighbors, some grateful, some furious. A line about him, organizing community rent assistance, that she mentally filed under excuses. The state recommended 6 years. When she spoke, her voice was cool and polished, the way it always was when she believed she was being especially clear. She talked about abuse of trust, about the vulnerability of elderly tenants, about how people depended on the court to protect them from exploitation. She never said elderly black man, but her gaze flicked over his lined face each time she mentioned someone in a position of informal authority in that community. The guidelines suggested 4 to 6 years. She went above them. 8 years in state prison. Restitution to the fullest extent possible. The granddaughter's breath caught in her throat. The public defender closed his eyes for half a second. Leonard merely stood a little straighter, as if bracing his spine around a weight he had half expected. The gavel cracked once, sharply. Courtroom 3B moved on. The elderly black man who had just been given a near decade of his remaining life in prison was led away in handcuffs. Judge Nora Hale felt nothing but the faint, familiar relief of a problem dealt with firmly and finally. She had no idea that this particular sentence was the one that would finally unravel her entire career. A judge who believed in patterns. Nora Hale had spent her life learning to trust patterns. She grew up in a neighborhood where the same faces appeared in police blotters and funeral announcements, where chaos felt hereditary. Her father's temper and her brother's arrest convinced her that people could be as predictable as bad weather maps. Law, for her, was the opposite of that chaos. Statutes, case law, sentencing charts, these were solid ground. She climbed them like a ladder. Scholarship kid, law review, prosecutor, then judge at 40. Colleagues described her with the usual glowing phrases: no nonsense, tough but fair, committed to public safety. Editorials praised her firm stance on repeat offenders and her refusal to hide behind soft-hearted excuses. What the editorials didn't see were the unspoken ways her concept of risk had hardened around certain images. The spreadsheets in her chambers told one story: docket numbers, offense levels, penalties imposed. The unspoken story sat in the gallery. Young black men in handcuffs, middle-aged black women charged with minor thefts, and, increasingly, elderly black men, grandfathers, retired janitors, former factory workers, accused of everything from small-time drug dealing to maintenance scams in crumbling apartment buildings. In her mind, there were the familiar endpoint of a line she'd drawn as a prosecutor: chaos that refused to grow up. When an elderly white man in a cardigan appeared in her courtroom for embezzling funds from his homeowners association, she saw a pillar of the community who had lost his way under financial pressure. He got 3 years, a restitution plan, and a lecture about honesty. When an elderly black man appeared on a nearly identical charge, small-scale financial deceit against neighbors, she saw someone who had chosen shortcuts his entire life. He got 7. The difference never appeared in the record. In the trial transcripts, the language looked neutral enough: community impact, abuse of trust, history, and characteristics of the defendant. Her clerk drafted the sentencing entries in dry, careful prose. It was only when you lined those entries up next to each other, when you saw elderly black man penciled in again and again against the longer sentences, that Nora's pattern stopped looking like justice and started looking like something else. But no one in her courtroom had the power or the data to do that. Not yet. The file on the analyst's desk, 3 floors above courtroom 3B, in a cramped office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink, a woman named Jada Brooks stared at a spreadsheet until her eyes blurred. She'd been hired by the county as a data analyst for criminal justice initiatives, which turned out to mean one person, one overworked laptop, and a mandate to see if the numbers show anything interesting about our courts. The assignment had started as an experiment: feed 6 years of sentencing data into her models, flag any unusual patterns. She expected a mess: missing entries, inconsistent codes, but she hadn't expected the graphs that were now blooming across her screen. For Judge Hale's courtroom, the bars were unmistakable. Strip out violent crimes. Focus only on nonviolent property and financial offenses. Then add 2 filters: defendant over 60, defendant's race. The disparity jumped like a siren. Elderly black men in Hale's court received, on average, sentences 40% longer than elderly white men with the same charges and comparable records. When Jada added in some notes from case files, prosecutor recommendations, plea deals accepted or rejected, the pattern didn't smooth out. If anything, it sharpened. Even when the prosecution recommended moderate sentences, the judge's deviations upward clustered around the same group: elderly black men who reminded everyone of somebody they'd grown up told to avoid. It was the kind of pattern that could be dismissed as statistical noise if you wanted to look away. Jada had been in enough meetings by now to know how easily numbers became context-dependent. This one was too loud for that, and it got louder every time she added another year of data. She saved the graphs into a folder called H03B_review and walked them down the hall to her supervisor, a polite man with a permanent stain on his tie and the haunted look of someone who'd been told to innovate without being given any power. He glanced at the printouts and frowned. "This is significant," he said carefully. "If it holds up." "It holds up," Jada said. "I triple-checked. It's not just 1 or 2 tough cases. It's a pattern. And look." She pointed to a printout listing specific case pairs. Elderly black man, 71, convicted of small-scale benefits fraud, 8 years. Elderly white man, 70, convicted of nearly identical conduct, 3 years and probation. Prosecutorial recommendations, nearly the same. Her supervisor pinched the bridge of his nose. "You know what happens if we send this upstairs," he said. "It becomes a sensitive matter. The presiding judge calls the presiding judge. People start talking about respecting judicial discretion." "She's not just being tough," Jada said. "She's being lopsided, and it keeps landing on the same people." He sighed. "Write it up," he said finally. "Short memo. Stick to the numbers. I'll forward it to the Judicial Conduct Commission liaison." He said it like someone who had said similar words a dozen times, watched memos disappear into polite silence, then gone back to his tie stain and his emails. This time, something else happened. The memo landed on the desk of a junior attorney at the Judicial Conduct Commission who, 2 weeks earlier, had taken a call from a nervous public defender about a weird pattern with my older black clients in Hale's courtroom. Patterns, she knew, got stronger when 2 different people described them in different languages. She put Jada's charts next to her notes and, for the first time, circled a name, Leonard Miles. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for Friday. She drew a red star next to it. The elderly black man's story. On the night before his sentencing, Leonard sat at his kitchen table, the same worn leather folder open in front of him. The apartment was small but tidy, walls lined with photographs. Kids in graduation gowns, church picnics, a much younger Leonard in a hard hat, standing on a half-built highway. His granddaughter, Aya, sat opposite him, still in her social worker ID badge, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. Leonard had never seen himself as a victim. He'd worked his entire adult life. Construction, factory shifts, late-night janitorial work. When a building owner asked him, informally, to keep an eye on things and collect small maintenance fees, it felt less like a job and more like what he'd always done: take care of the people around him. What the owner didn't mention was how badly the building's finances were already tangled, or how quick he'd be to blame Leonard when the city finally noticed. The charges had hit like a wave. Unauthorized fees. Coercive tactics. The words in the indictment didn't sound anything like the conversations Leonard remembered. Mrs. Ortiz asking him to hold her rent a few days, Mr. Blake slipping him a 20 for fixing a leak. Neighbors pooling money to cover someone's overdue bill. He had a folder full of notes, scribbled IOUs that started Leo. Can you help me with? Envelopes with cash amounts written on them, lists of which tenants he'd quietly covered when a landlord threatened eviction. To him, it was proof that the money had moved toward people, not away from them. To the prosecutor, it looked like unreported cash and sloppy bookkeeping. His public defender, overworked and honest, had tried to explain it. The system doesn't handle messy kindness very well. It needs clean lines. Leonard had refused the plea that would have given him 2 years. He could survive 2 years, maybe, but the words would attach to him forever. Fraud, thief, predator. They would hang around his grandchildren's necks every time someone said, "Isn't your granddad the one who?" So he'd rolled the dice on trial. Now the dice had landed. Guilty. 8 years. Aya whispered, staring down at the table. "Granddad, you're 68. You can't." He reached across and covered her hand with his. "I've been old since 40, he said gently. "This is just math catching up." "Don't joke," she snapped, and then immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. "I'm sorry. This isn't right." The tenants wrote letters. They said you helped them, they said. Some did, he said. Some didn't. Fear makes people remember things differently. The landlord's lawyer knocked on their doors and told them what this would look like in court. Folks will say what they think they need to say to survive. I can't blame them for that. Aya's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be the one paying the price," she said. He looked at the folder, at the half-century of receipts, notes, and photos crammed into it. His life, reduced to paperwork that the judge would never really read. "I don't think I'm the only one paying it," he said quietly. "I think there's a whole line of men behind me. Looks like me. Same age, same tired knees. I just happen to be the one standing in front today." He didn't know that, across town, an analyst was circling his name on a printout labeled elderly black male defendants. H cases. He just knew, in his bones, what the pattern felt like. He'd been watching it all his life. The sentence that tripped the wire. When Judge Hale handed down 8 years, something in the system that usually slept decided for once not to. The commission liaison who'd circled Leonard's name watched the hearing from the back row, her notebook balanced on her knee. She saw an elderly black man stand as straight as he could while the judge spoke about abuse of trust without once mentioning the landlord's role. She jotted down phrases that matched phrases from other transcripts. Examples to the community. Certain age where you should know better. They all landed on the same kind of defendant. As Leonard was led away, she sent a quiet text to Jada. Sentence, 8 years. Deviation +2 above guideline. Deaf, elderly black male. Same pattern. Jada replied with a single word, logged. By the time Nora Hale took off her robe that afternoon, the memo about her sentencing patterns had moved up 2 levels. By the next morning, it was sitting on the desk of the chair of the state's Judicial Conduct Commission. By the end of the week, Leonard's case number had been underlined 3 times in red. The truth she never meant to see. The letter arrived in Judge Hale's chambers in a stiff, cream-colored envelope stamped with the seal of the commission. It used the polite, distant language of bureaucracy, but the meaning cut past the formalities, a preliminary inquiry into potential disparities in her sentencing of elderly black male defendants. It named no cases, yet she saw faces as she read it. A man who'd stolen prescription pills, a grandfather who'd signed someone else's Social Security check, Leonard with his folder and his quiet eyes. There was a graph enclosed. It was simple, almost insultingly so. 2 clusters of bars side by side. Elderly white men. Elderly black men. Same offenses. The blue bars were lower. The red bars, in every cluster labeled black male, 60 plus, climbed higher. Her first reaction was anger. At whoever had pulled the numbers. At people who don't understand what it's like in here. At the idea that she, who had grown up surrounded by chaos, was being accused of injustice. She told herself it was missing context, that the elderly black men in her courtroom had different attitudes on the stand, different histories, different risk profiles. She even believed it for a moment. Then she caught herself thinking it. Different attitude, different feel. She stared at the thought like it belonged to someone else. It wasn't an accusation she was used to hearing pointed at her. She'd spent years assuring herself that she was tough on everyone. She'd sentenced plenty of white defendants. She could list them by name, but the numbers refused to look away. The commission wanted records, transcripts, audio, where it existed. Jada's memo, now attached, mentioned Leonard's case as the most recent example of upward deviation from both guidelines and prosecutorial recommendations. They wanted to know why, in that case, she had gone 2 years above what even the state had asked for. She did what judges do when threatened. She pulled the file. It was the first time she read it like someone whose verdict might be under review. She saw the charges, the missing receipts, the landlord's complaint. She saw a few tenant statements about pressure and confusing fees. Buried halfway through, she saw something she had skimmed before. A letter from a church deacon describing years of Leonard quietly covering rent for neighbors, paying utility bills out of his own thinning savings, organizing food drives when the building's heating went out. She saw the granddaughter's letter, neatly typed, describing an elderly black man who had raised her after her mother's death, who woke up at 4 every morning to check the hallway lights and the boiler, who kept handwritten lists of who owed what as much to shame himself into fairness as to track anyone else. She saw the public defender's plea, that whatever irregularities had occurred, they had occurred in the fog between informal charity and formal accounting, not in the heart of a con man. She saw all the places where she had written in phrases like pattern of deceit and long-standing willingness to manipulate others, based less on the page than on the story she had told herself about men who walked into her courtroom looking like Leonard. The truth wasn't only that she had been harsh. It was that she had been lazy in a way she had always accused others of being. She had let one kind of defendant's story write itself. The commission summoned her for an interview. They asked about guidelines, about discretion, about how she weighed factors like age and community ties. They showed her anonymized case pairs, elderly white defendant, elderly black defendant, same crime, same recommendation from the prosecutor. They laid her sentences side by side, stripped of names and faces. She tried to explain it as intuition, as demeanor, as things you pick up in a room after years on the bench. The words sounded thin even to her own ears. The truth, which she did not yet admit out loud, was simpler. When an elderly black man stood before her, the chaos of her childhood hummed louder in her veins. Pregnant with assumptions, hungry for an example to make. It had always felt like being responsible. The numbers called it something else. When the elderly black man walked back in, the commission moved faster than anyone expected. Under pressure from activists, defense attorneys, and a few quietly disgusted colleagues, they ordered a review of all nonviolent cases involving elderly black men sentenced by Judge Hale over the past 10 years. Leonard's case was among the first flagged for potential resentencing. By the time he shuffled back in a courtroom 3B 5 months later, escorted by a different bailiff and wearing the same faded suit, The room felt different. There was a new judge on the bench, temporarily assigned while the commission completed its proceedings. Journalists sat in the back, pretending not to be journalists. A row of older black men occupied one side of the gallery, some in prison khaki, some in civilian clothes, all with case numbers that had once passed under Nora Hale's gavel. Leonard sat at the defense table with a different lawyer this time, a volunteer from a nonprofit that had sprung to life overnight when the disparity graphs hit the local news. The new judge reviewed the file slowly out loud. She noted the landlord's mismanagement, which had now been corroborated by city inspectors. She noted that several of the victims had filed affidavits recanting portions of their statements, saying they'd felt pressured by the landlord and his lawyer to describe Leonard as a collector rather than a neighbor helping juggle overdue bills. She noted the church's records of community funds that matched amounts in Leonard's unreadable but earnest ledgers. She noted the lack of actual personal enrichment. When she finally announced that the conviction would be reduced to a misdemeanor, with Leonard sentenced to time served and placed on supervised community service instead of prison, Aya exhaled so violently it sounded like a sob. The elderly black man who had once shuffled out of that room with 8 years on his back walked out, this time a free man, as much as any man could be free while still carrying that first sentence in his memory. Outside the courthouse, cameras clustered around him, microphones pointed at his lined face. He was not a speechmaker by nature. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood that this moment was not just about him. So he looked into the nearest lens and said, in a voice roughened by years and restraint, that he was one of many, that there were other elderly black men who had stood where he did before the same judge under the same weight of assumptions. He said that he forgave because he needed to in order to sleep at night. He did not say that forgiveness felt, in that moment, like lifting something his back had not yet fully recovered from. Aftermath. Judge Nora Hale did not preside over Leonard's resentencing. She watched a clip of it later on the news, alone in her living room, the sound low, the captions flickering. The commission's findings came down a month after that. They did not accuse her of overt racism. No one had found slurs in her transcripts or screaming tirades in chambers. They used careful, devastating phrases, unconscious bias, consistent disparity, failure to adequately account for mitigating factors in specific demographic groups. They recommended suspension, mandatory training, a monitored return to the bench. Public pressure pushed the recommendations further. Local bar associations, emboldened, raised their own concerns. Organizations representing black elders demanded more than training. In the end, Nora chose to resign rather than sit through a drawn-out process. The statement she issued to the press spoke of regret if any perception of unfairness arose, and of her decades of service. It did not mention elderly black men. It did not mention Leonard. In quieter conversations, she began, slowly, to admit to herself that grief curled somewhere inside her. Grief not just at the loss of her job, but at the shattering of the story she'd built her identity on. If she wasn't tough, but fair, what was she? If the elderly black man she'd sentenced so confidently had been, in fact, more careful with his neighbors than she had been with her own power, what did that make her? Those were questions no commission could answer for her. 6 months later, 6 months after his release, Leonard walked into a different building, a low-slung community center that had once been a grocery store. The sign over the door read, Sentencing Equity Project, in peeling blue letters. Inside, a small team of staff and volunteers sat behind mismatched desks, hunched over printouts and laptops. Walls were covered in graphs and sticky notes. Names of judges, clusters of case numbers, colored dots marking disparities. Jada was there, now on loan full-time from the county. Aya sat beside her, using her social work training to collect stories from older defendants whose cases were being reviewed. When Leonard entered, both women looked up and smiled. He'd resisted getting involved at first. Prison had left him tired in a way that went beyond age. But he came anyway, twice a week, to help translate the numbers into lives. He sat in on intake interviews with other elderly black men, men who had been sentenced harshly for shoplifting, minor fraud, small-scale drug possession. He listened to them describe the sensation of standing before a bench that fell higher than it looked, hearing years handed down in a tone that suggested they'd already lived too long. He helped Jada understand when a pattern in the data represented more than just non-compliance, when a spike in sentencing lined up with a rumor about a judge cracking down. He became, without entirely meaning to, the human face of the graphs. One afternoon, he stood in front of a group of new law students who'd come to the center for a seminar. The projector behind him showed a slide with two bars, red and blue, labeled elderly defendants, nonviolent offenses. The red bar, elderly black men, towered over the blue. He told them about his case in simple terms, about the landlord, the neighbors, the folder full of messy kindness that had looked like fraud from the right angle. He told them about standing in front of Judge Hale, an elderly black man whose entire life had folded into 3 pages she had not really read. He told them about the day he'd walked out, and the other men who still hadn't. Then he pointed at the slide. "This is what happens," he said, "when people like me are only ever seen at the end of the story. When you grow up seeing elderly black men as trouble that never learned, and you never stop to ask what they've been carrying or who they've been holding up." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The judge who sentenced me," he added, after a moment, "was not a monster. She was a person who thought she knew the truth just by looking at me and my file. The problem is that the system let her keep thinking that for 20 years. He looked around the room at the young faces staring back at him, some uneasy, some angry, some simply thoughtful. "Your job," he said, "if you're going to work in that system, is to make sure that doesn't happen again. Not just by catching the next Nora Hale, but by catching yourselves when you start thinking you can tell the whole story just from someone's age, their charge, and the color of their skin." Outside, the city moved on. Landlords still found new ways to squeeze tenants. Courtrooms still filled each morning. But in one of those courtrooms, a new judge now kept a copy of Jada's graphs in her desk drawer, a quiet reminder that elderly black man was not a synonym for a lost cause, and that guidelines were not the same thing as justice. And in the community center that had once been a grocery store, an elderly black man with a worn leather folder and a back that still ached sometimes spent his days helping strangers he would once never have met, making sure that the truth about him and about others like him would not be so easy to ignore the next time it walked into a courtroom.